Is our second iteration of the Understanding Genocide series that Pearl is running. My name is Archana. I am Senior Advocacy Officer at Pearl. So we engage in advocacy with politicians and lawmakers in Canada, working with our broader team to kind of push for accountability and justice in Sri Lanka. The Pearl wanted to start this Understanding Genocide series because we know that the term genocide is used very often within the Eelam Tamil community. We know that term is very meaningful for us for a lot of different ways. And we don't really have open conversations about that word, which we know is a legal word, and it's often quite complicated. And I would say it's mired in legalese, and it's very difficult to kind of understand the concepts and everything just in plain language. And so the Understanding Genocide series was to explore different facets of genocide work, genocide recognition, the definitions of genocide in different contexts, to kind of explore and understand better what we mean when we say the word genocide and the work that we do. It's really important to talk about genocide in our community, and it's a really important word to kind of understand and interrogate a little. And that's especially true within the month of November, which, the Eelam Tamil community commemorates Maveerar Naal in November. Maveerar Naal is when we remember, everyone who took that step to fight for justice and to lay their life on the line for, the ideals of democracy, the ideals of respect, of dignity. And it's a very, very painful time for us. It's a very, very reflective time for us. And so we thought that this conversation about memory and memorialization would work very well within this context. Because we're going to be talking about genocide and these difficult conversations, I think it's really, I wanted to say put a trigger warning out there. If this conversation is difficult, please feel free to leave. You can always come back at it at another point. So make sure that you take care of yourself while we're having this conversation. Before we start, and while we're talking about genocide and Maveerar Naal and memorialization, it's obviously key that we talk about Indigenous genocide and the recognition of genocide within Turtle Island and the places that we live and the places that we've settled. And so I wanted to acknowledge that I personally am meeting on, and I think everyone on Turtle Island is meeting on Aboriginal land that's been inhabited by Indigenous people from time immemorial. As settlers, as refugees, we're grateful for their welcome, and we thank the generations of people who have taken care. From Toronto, I would like to say that we are grateful for the Ojibwe Nation, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the land that we're on is part of the Upper Canada Treaties. It's important to talk about the recognition of genocide for the Indigenous communities and our collective challenge and commitment towards truth and reconciliation and justice. So we are having this conversation with Samantha Lakin. Samantha Lakin has done significant work on genocide and genocide recognition throughout different areas. And so she is an advanced PhD candidate at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She was a graduate research fellow at the program of negotiation at Harvard Law School and a Fulbright scholar in Rwanda from 2017 to 2018 and in Switzerland. She has conducted research and analysis on genocide, documenting and analyzing local perspectives of memory and transitional justice in the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. She has expertise in access to justice in post-conflict settings, including in Rwanda and the Great Lakes region of Africa. She's widely published. Her first book is called The Heroines of Vichy France, Rescuing French Jews During the Holocaust. And she has a master's in international law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. You can find more information about her at samanthalakin.com. So I'm just going to turn it over to Samantha Lakin so that she can kind of give a brief overview of her presentation. Before we start, I just want to say this is a safe space. We just, make sure that you're not disruptive, make sure that you're respectful, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you to Pearl, Archana, for having me. So one thing I wanted to mention before we begin is, as you can see from what happened in the beginning of the recording, issues of discussing genocide, discussing memorialization and justice in the aftermath of different kinds of political violence, atrocity crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide are very, very sensitive and very close to people's hearts. Because the truth is that people really lost a lot, in all kinds of ways, victims, others. And so I think it's important to recognize that while we'll have a discussion about, legal definitions and sociological definitions of genocide, while I'll talk a bit about what's going on in the Rwandan case, 26 years after the genocide ended in 1994, this conversation is really to help you as an educational tool to gain information in order to make decisions and understanding different contexts and decide if you want to get involved in different ways across the globe to figure out how to do that with more informed knowledge. And so my specializations as a doctoral candidate at Clark University, the Strasser Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, are genocide theory, and then also transitional justice, memory, and memorialization in the Great Lakes region of Africa. I've been working in Rwanda for the past 7 years, and through that has formed the foundation of my doctoral dissertation. My dissertation looks at local perspectives of memory and justice, including meaning making via attending public commemorations, genocide commemorations, and visiting, building, creating memorial sites and spaces, which are quite prolific in the Rwandan case. And so that's most of what I will talk about today with Archana, and hoping that you just get some ideas, some information, some things to look up further, et cetera. So again, thank you to Pearl. I'm pleased to be here, especially to be a part of your educational initiative. So,
thanks so much, Samantha.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to have a conversation. Sorry, did I interrupt you?
Nope, I was just going to ask if you wanted me to speak a bit more about the work, or if you wanted to start with questions. I know today I'll mostly be conversation format, and then we'll open it up to questions from those of you who are listening in.
Why don't I ask you just like broad general questions? I have some specific questions about your work too, and how you got into genocide studies. And so, so maybe we can do it like that. In terms of your work and everything that you do, I just wanted to say, before we start off, like we had an initial session earlier on in the year where we talked about what even is genocide, like what does the term mean, what are the different understandings and definitions. So based on what the work that you do and your experience and knowledge, can you tell me like what is genocide?
Sure, so genocide is a particular crime category. And the genocide came around as a term as a result of a large number of negotiations with the kind of champion for this issue, Raphael Lemkin, who was working in Europe and later in the United States on drafting and creating and ratifying what became the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, approved by the United Nations in 1948. And according to the Genocide Convention, Article 2 is the most well-known, that says genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of that group to another group. And so the legal definition is as it states in the convention. What I think is important to mention when we think about genocide, especially, we see it in media and news used in order to mobilize people or make people feel like a situation is particularly bad. I don't feel from my own work and research that genocide is necessarily the hierarchy or kind of the penultimate crime when you think about three crime categories linked together, which are also war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide, and then additionally a fourth crime of ethnic cleansing. They all have different patterns. Patterns of preparation, patterns of planning, whether intent needs to be established in a court of law in order to call something a certain crime category. But when you look at the actual violence, the ways and patterns of killing, the systematic and widespread nature of those kinds of acts of killing, and the consequences suffered, I think the legal definitions don't make that much of a difference in terms of the lived experience of people who suffered any of those crimes. And so when I think about the legal definition, and again, many scholars also discuss this, that the legal definition is one way to identify crimes of genocide, but there are also sociological implications and definitions and also limitations. Political groups, sexual groups of sexual orientation are left out of the Genocide Convention for various reasons based on initial discussions in the 1940s. So for me, I think as a social scientist, it's important to understand the legal definitions and what their use is. But then when we think about victims and also perpetrators who may have suffered because they were in prison for long periods of time and had to re-enter into society, and all of these adjustments in a post-atrocity or post-genocide society, the label matters, but to what extent when you're really talking about communities and people on the ground. So for me, that is kind of my perspective on the legal and sociological understandings and definitions of genocide and these subsequent crime categories.
Right. Thank you. And I think that's so important. We will always get so caught up in this, like the legal definition as seen as this like threshold of importance, right? And I think that really takes away from the lived reality of people that actually go through these atrocity crimes and the kind of traumas and collective like histories that they always bear. And so I really appreciate the importance, of the, I really appreciate the importance of you highlighting, the sociological definitions and, centering the lived realities of people. I think that's really important. As kind of a related question, like, what do you think about genocides that have not been legally recognized formally at like a court or at the or like through the International Criminal Court and things like that? We consider what happened in Sri Lanka to be a genocide, but this is not recognized or it hasn't been put through the court system yet. And so often there's just like, should we even call it a genocide? What does that mean? So I was hoping you can shed some light on that as well.
Right. I think the broader question comes to what are the options for accountability? What are the options for helping communities rebuild social ties, rebuild faith and trust in the government, if possible, and in neighbors and other communities that, first of all, their experiences are validated, that they didn't kind of suffer for nothing. And second of all, that there'll be non-repetition, right? So that these crimes won't happen to the same group or any group really again. And so for me, in the international legal order, especially coming from a Western perspective, most people do believe that, court-based systems are kind of the highest form of justice, right? That if it's not tried and defined in a court of law, like the International Criminal Court, or a hybrid or special court like the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, which were established for these two particular cases. And in the case of the ICTY, most of the cases were on ethnic cleansing. There were few cases that actually tried for genocide. The Srebrenica massacre is one of the more infamous cases where they were tried for crimes of genocide because of the patterns of violence. And so for me, I think it's more about the outcome. And again, many people believe that the court determines the importance and the weight of the crimes. So for me, I think there are other ways to hold people accountable beyond court systems, and to also restore social ties and ensure that governments are protecting their citizens. The issue also with courts is that they are expensive.
Yeah.
They often rely on the political will of either the UN Security Council or certain member states. With the ICC, it deals with referring states, so states have to refer a state to be or a leader to be monitored and indicted. International courts also deal with individual culpability, so they're trying individuals, mostly what we call the big fish, those who are planning, organizing, implementing these crimes. And so in that case, it becomes challenging when you have potentially a large number of perpetrators. And perpetrating is also highly diverse. Some people are coerced. If you're not with us, you're against us. If you don't do this. Some people never kill or anything and are just part of a public or mass killing in many ways. And so they don't see themselves as guilty, even though they were just there. So these kinds of questions, I think, again, lead to the broader understanding of how do we restore social ties, hold people accountable for past actions, and hold government accountable. So when I think about advocacy efforts, I think that, the legal definition helps for sure, because what it does, at least with genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, is it kind of creates, and this is the case in Rwanda, where the ICTR created basically an undeniable, undisputable fact that genocide did take place against the Tutsi people, members of the Tutsi group, in the months of April to July of 1994. And so that becomes a legally kind of non-disputable fact, which means that advocacy increases, research increases, reparations increase when you have that label. What happens when that label is not possible or may take a lot of time legally? Again, other options, I think, are engaging in symbolic reparations and other kinds of forms of community building, truth-seeking and truth-telling that may create very high meaning for communities and groups that are completely unrelated to the juridical or court-based system.
Yeah.
And those can happen regardless of labels, regardless of courts. They can happen in parallel. And as my research has shown in Rwanda, genocide memory, while there are a lot of issues and questions and things that kind of interfere with processes of what memory can provide, they actually do provide a lot of value to individuals. And so that's one example of a symbolic reparation, meaning it has nothing to do with punishment. It has more to do with restoring victims and communities, and it's not based in a juridical court-based system.
No, thank you so much for that. And the idea of working of these as processes that are working in tandem or parallel, I think that's really important, because I studied a little bit of genocide when I was in undergrad, and I remember one thing I still think about now. Like I think it was during the Rwandan trials. Like people in these remote villages, like they had no idea what was happening. Courts are super westernized, and it's in this like other language. It's far away from the center of where the atrocities happened. It was like, it was being done at this like other place. But what was transitional justice and what was like accounting for that justice being done within a local context was two entirely different things. And so there's this great deal of disconnect between juridical understandings of genocide and like these legal findings, and yet like the lived realities of how people actually move on. So I 100% agree that like, obviously the advocacy on the legal stage is so important for accountability, for command responsibility, for holding these, like senior officers and politicians to account. But I really, the secondary, or like the equal part of like what's happening locally is also really, really important too. And I know, the Rwandan cases, there's so much examples of like what's being done, within the local communities between people that were fighting. Can you tell us a little bit about, your work in Rwanda and what you've seen there, and what instruments were used for justice and accountability, but in the social sense, I think, in Rwanda?
Yeah, sure. So I think that a couple of the most interesting findings from, again, these 7 years back and forth doing research in Rwanda, the first is that I really chose to speak to and work with basically individuals from different backgrounds. So those who are legally recognized as victims or survivors, meaning that they were persecuted because of their Tutsi or past Tutsi identity. Those who were in prison because of acts of perpetrating genocide. Ordinary citizens who were neither targeted because of their Tutsi identity, meaning that they were Hutu, except, and they were also not in prison. So some of them were rescuers, some of them just escaped. They didn't want to participate and they weren't forced or coerced. So these ordinary citizens. So I really tried to focus on the local individuals who had something to say about memory processes and who had certainly engaged in them, but who didn't have necessarily a political or professional stake in the kind of genocide memory landscape. To mention, though, I also did a series with key informants, so those who did either work professionally for government, for non-governmental organizations, or for other organizations that do deal with issues of memory and justice. So those were kind of the 4 groups of people who I interviewed. And I think that a couple of the most surprising findings were that early on, people were skeptical of going to, especially public commemorations, especially those who felt like the genocide wasn't their problem, even though it was very clear that every Rwandan suffered from the genocide, suffered in some way. People were way worse off during the genocide than they have been since in Rwanda. And most Rwandans will recognize that they never want to go back to that place. Regardless of their engagement with justice, their satisfaction, et cetera. Nobody wants to be in that place again. So in the beginning, people really felt like it was a survivor's issue, maybe wasn't for them to engage in. And there was some fear about coming back together with the victim community. In local communities in Rwanda, people know each other. And they've known each other for a long time. And many people left their home areas for cities, for Kigali, et cetera, and mixed together. But those who remained in especially rural villages and elsewhere, they knew their neighbors, they knew what people had done. And so I think it was quite challenging to rebuild that trust, and a lot of people didn't want to attend the public commemorations. And over time, there have been a lot of sensitization from government about why it's important to attend. Even some people, some scholars especially, claim that, it's required to attend, either whether socially obligated or legally mandated. It's not legally mandated, but it's really not good to not go. And so over time, we see this public participation becoming much more widespread, and people generally becoming more comfortable with confronting what happened, what their parents may have done, what, who they lost, etc. So the coming together, though, seems to be, and the public show of participation seems to be quite important for survivors. That even if people are not fully like believing or engaged, the fact that they show up and the fact that they're there is actually quite important. Because what happens is afterward, those neighbors who really feel as if they can and want to support survivors, they do, so we see people visiting memorial sites on the day that someone might have been killed, the place they were buried, and neighbors who go to visit those sites are not from one group or the other. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes they're not. Immediately after the genocide, you had children of survivors bringing perpetrators food in prison. So the children would go together. They might not really have had such a clear idea of what was going on, but like a widow and a mother whose husband was in prison would send the kids to bring food together. So these kinds of things are really interesting, I think, outcomes of the aftermath and how people have just decided or made it work to live together. Things are not perfect by far. During the commemoration months, there's still intimidation of survivors and victims. Once in a while, someone is murdered or killed because of information they disclose or because of their position, which is really not a great outcome 26 years later. But I think that slowly things are coming back and being normalized. I also think that the educational system helps, where students are being educated about peace education, about critical thinking skills, and those kinds of things I think really help focus on this young generation in Rwanda. But I think that the stories I found, especially from local individuals, were quite surprising sometimes when they talked about why people didn't want to go or why people felt concerned about being looked at negatively by their neighbors, and how these social ties have taken time to rebuild, especially among people who really knew each other well. And then the genocide, of course, is meant to destroy social relationships and social ties, and then rebuilding them amongst people who had very trusting and good relationships for the most part, and that were shattered. So I hope that's helpful in terms of some of the things that I've heard from the, I think I did a series of 100 interviews with individuals.
Thank you. That's, so fascinating. And, how do you how do you come back together? When you live in these communities, how do you, repair social ties? Those are all really, really important things to, consider, and I'm sure very difficult processes that obviously take a very long time, as you mentioned. It's interesting because I obviously, I come from the Sri Lankan context. And so here, very different, because the perpetrator was the state. And it was not that there were intermingled communities. It was the idea of the state being the perpetrator, and then the state, winning whatever conflict it was, and then further consolidating its supremacy and complete control, And so when we talk about post-conflict situations and all these aspects of transitional justice from a community perspective, I was wondering if you had anything to say about what is transitional justice, and how does it look like when the state's the perpetrator, or in a context of victor's justice. I don't know if you had anything to say about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that transitional justice has two key words, right? Transition and justice. And so the concept or theory of transitional justice is in cases where ordinary justice systems might not be sufficient to provide redress, accountability, et cetera. What are some of the other mechanisms and other ways to provide a sense of justice that is really good enough. Any process cannot bring back the dead and bring back, what was lost, meaning livelihoods, meaning future generations, meaning, all of the things that are needed to support a family and live a, good and positive life. So transitional justice was kind of the concept introduced to provide this kind of justice in states and societies that were transitioning from conflict, atrocity, crimes, et cetera, to peace. And so in a number of cases, especially in Latin America, we see basically a non-transition of government, right? So government was perpetrating the crimes against people. There was not a change in government after the kind of heat of the conflict or crimes ended, and trials would never work because states would never try their own leaders, would never turn them in, et cetera. And so some mechanisms were created actually to attempt to provide justice without holding those individuals accountable. And so those are cases in which political transition or leadership transition in terms of like the party and perpetrating kind of state did not happen. And so in some ways, transitional justice can be viewed as a compromise, especially when the state will not or cannot try their own people, their own leaders. At the ICC, we have the complementarity principle through the Rome Statute that if a state is unwilling or unable to try their own, leaders, that is a reason when the ICC could step in. But prior to that, we don't really have a lot of, evidence on complementarity. So again, I think that, leadership and power are really strong things to have to try and overcome and change and push for justice. And so when there's not a transition in leadership, meaning that the same people or even the same group, maybe not the same individuals themselves, but those who are trained by them and who are of the same ideology, when there is no transition, it becomes really difficult to hold leaders accountable. And so I think that those cases are, again, particularly challenging in terms of a legal perspective. I do think that truth seeking and truth telling is one of the things that can happen, especially among communities. If people don't know where their loved ones are buried, if they don't know within a community where there might have been a mass grave or a massacre site, how their loved ones were killed, if they sometimes think they're still alive, they may be wandering the earth or being somewhere, and people sometimes attend commemorative events or something to try and actually find someone. So that kind of closure of understanding that this person died in this way can really provide survivors with some kind of ability to place what happened in a past context, to know and have peace of mind that their loved one actually has died, and potentially be able to provide some kind of burial or ritual for them, whether body or anything is available. These kinds of things I think are truly universal, even though the processes of remembering and mourning the dead differ from culture to culture. That sense of peace and kind of closure that people has been described to me, that they find is really important. So again, that's engaging people who committed crimes with those who are still seeking to know about what happened. So I do think that, truth seeking doesn't have to happen also through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In fact, oftentimes it becomes very messy and politicized to do it that way. And people don't feel satisfied with those processes. Priscilla Hayner, who's a scholar, has this reference, which I think is really interesting, where she basically says, it's as if someone comes and gets undressed in front of this committee and are like kind of bearing their soul and speaking, and then they're
Mm-hmm.
not given sufficient time to like get fully dressed and leave. It's as if this metaphor of like they're kind of still vulnerable.
Yeah.
So there are other ways I think to engage in truth seeking again that can be meaningful in terms of justice and
Yeah.
moving forward.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And that really is so important, and it really hits home for me, especially this month, in the absence of like legal accountability. I think like, my community has done so much work, over decades of like engaging in truth seeking and engaging in like community care and community healing. So, and I'm thinking about like, there's the mothers of the disappeared, how we call them, Tamil mothers who lost their children, or the children were disappeared, or they just don't know where they are. Especially in 2009, and they've been protesting on the road for the past 3 years now, being like, where's my son? I like, as for all communities, like death is very sacred for us, and there's all these rituals and commemorations that we do like yearly for a departed. And so not knowing, and the idea of not knowing where they are is so heartbreaking. And so that's why we have Maveerar Naal month, and we have the day where we all come together, and this is for not just the people in our communities or the people in our families that we know, but everyone, having this like symbolic day to place flowers, to like light a candle, to make a prayer, to remember, in the absence of this like legal accountability, that is truth making, that is truth seeking, and it's so meaningful and it's so healing. And so I 100% hear you, and I live that, and I think everyone on this call does live that. And so thank you so much for mentioning that. And I guess we can sort of transition into our next conversation about memory and memorialization as a whole. What is truth seeking? What is memory? And I know you've touched on this already, but like, why are these processes important when discussing genocide and in understanding these diverse senses of justice, is how you call it, I think, in some of the talks that you've given?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most important things to remember, and one thing that has really come out in my research, although it's not surprising at all, is that justice means different things to different people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, sometimes individuals are kind of sensitized to believe when they hear the word justice, whether in the Western language or the native language, they think about a courtroom, they think about a judge, they think about lawyers. And
Mm-hmm.
so immediately their mind goes to that situation or that setting. In Rwanda as well, the next most kind of popular, frequent thing are the gacaca courts, which happen
I was
between
gonna ask. Mm-hmm.
neighbors, and there's a whole bunch of literature on that I won't get into, and also anecdotes and interviews. But these are the two main things people think of when they think about justice. And so oftentimes in the interviews, people did not directly connect experiences of
Mm-hmm.
engaging in genocide memory with notions of justice. Yet through my analysis, I was able to really see that there was justice that could be provided or understood that did not rely at all on what a court or a state could give people, right? So it didn't rely on monetary reparations, it didn't rely on labels or punishment. Rather, they had to do with the ways in which, as I said, the communities were approaching the past violence, recognition, et cetera. I think what's challenging about memorialization is that there are many theories of the positive things that memorialization can provide people in an ideal sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
A sense of understanding their place in the community, a sense of security for the future,
Mm-hmm.
that things are not going to happen again if people understand the seriousness of past crimes, et cetera. But that is not often the case in most post-genocidal societies. And so I think one of the most important things to remember is that there are people who are not able to do the things that that you mentioned, are not able to hold a mass, are not able to lay flowers. And I'm not necessarily talking about like survivors, but others who may have suffered, for example, during a decade of violence, not to conflate or combine the genocide, which is a unique and distinct crime perpetrated against Tutsi people, with a civil war that was also taking place. But other people lost many things and many people, not as a result of genocide, but as a result of confusion, as a result of war, in this longer period of 1990 to 2000. And so, it becomes very challenging to figure out when can those people be recognized. It doesn't necessarily need to happen during the genocide commemoration, because we are focusing on the genocide against the Tutsi people as it was defined. But what happens in a society when some people can't remember their own at another time, or in another way, especially privately? And so my research has looked a little bit at that as well, at what happens with further tensions or not when people can't do those things. And so these are some of the complications around, hierarchies of victimhood, or hierarchies of who's allowed to remember in what ways and when. And of course, victimhood is also, it's a status. If you're legally defined as a victim, you're entitled, from the basic principles of rights to reparations, you're entitled to certain reparations and to certain things. And so victimhood is often can be a currency to help people organize, to help them make claims about what they want and need as a victim community. Of course, victim communities are also diverse, and not every victim or survivor feels the same or wants the same thing. So these are some of the complexities, I think, around memorialization that really play out in a real world experience, real world example, that theory on the theoretical level may not mention, but many, many studies have gone into these questions of South Africa, of Northern Ireland, of Rwanda, Burundi, et cetera. And so these are some of the conversations, I think, and the questions we need to be asking ourselves in order to ensure that memorialization and genocide memory is really providing opportunities for people to come together.
No, absolutely. And so I think the key there is like having that space, right? Like having that space for people and allowing people to have that memory. Yeah, and obviously it's a very complicated process, and it's different for everyone based on their lived experiences, based on their families' lived experiences as well. I wanted to have a conversation because this is something that, personally really does interest me, and then perhaps we can move on to questions after that. Can you talk us about the significance of memorial sites, statues, physical spaces, even photographs, like within the Sri Lankan context? I know we used to have, graveyards and like memorial sites and places for people to go and to lay flowers and, to take that space for themselves. And one thing that happened after the war in 2009 is all those memorial spaces were totally razed down by the perpetrator state. And instead, these like very overtly triumphalist statues were placed in, places where like mass atrocities happen. And those statues still are on that landscape. And I think about that all the time. And so within that, like, what is the importance of, having spaces, having these sites, and how does like having these very triumphalist sites as well kind of impact justice seeking and memory making and, healing, I guess?
Yeah, I think the answer, or one answer, is to me very surprising. When I was interviewing individuals in Rwanda, some people said that they really feel the sites and spaces are necessary because it gives them, the ability to, on the day that that person was murdered, or on the day that a particular massacre happened at like Nyamata Church, they can go, they can lay flowers, they can gather people together and talk about the merits and the memories of those who died. They can do something that feels tangible, like laying flowers or in Rwanda, like sharing drinks is a way to start a conversation and you know, honor people and conversations as well. And so the sites are really important for some people because they provide that avenue or that process to start actually talking about what happened and remembering in ways that feel appropriate, whether that's crying or laughing about the way that a family member used to walk or was telling jokes or something, in all the diversities of the way that, you know, grief and remembrance show up. Others, however, said that they don't need a memorial at all to remember their loved ones. They remember them every moment of every day. And so the memorial sites and spaces are fine, but they don't provide any added value for their own lives and memory. Many people acknowledge the value of these sites in terms of education, especially for youth, making it easier to facilitate conversation with children and also international people. You know, Rwanda, for example, has a huge tourism industry, especially because of the rainforests and the gorillas and just the beautiful landscape and things like that. And so part of people being engaged, international people in Rwanda, is understanding and knowing about the genocide as well. Another thing, of course, is that victims who are buried are no longer buried at home plots or anything like that. They are buried in memorial sites. And so that aspect of, you know, people are still finding their relatives. Even when I was in Rwanda for my field work 2 years ago, I attended 2 burials of friends who found one uncle and one parent and were reburying them in a memorial site. So it's still happening, where mass graves are being found or individuals are learning where someone was kind of like thrown or killed and reburying. So again, that's another importance of the physical site. So I think it really depends on the person. One thing I think that's quite interesting is what's happening in the United States, what we've seen, you know, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, is that many of the Confederate statues, you know, that are reminiscent of slavery and the Civil War are harmful reminders to people. When you go to your campus, you know, at University of Georgia, and you see, or anywhere, and you see certain statues to certain, you know, heroes, they cause trauma, or, you know, they feel like an affront to your own experience and victimhood. And so I think that's also an interesting question, right? About whose stories do we tell, and how do we engage in things that might be like really proud for someone, but really harmful for someone else, and these negotiations around that. So I think it's been interesting to apply it in the US case, of like the victor's justice and who gets, you know, put in a statue or gets a hall named after them, or you know, stadium or school.
I mean, Edward Said said something about the importance of a remembered presence. And so I think within the context of like victor's justice, you know, whether, like, I think these sites are really important, but also like just acknowledgement of what went wrong, of the violence that was done. That is so key. And that, you know, like that, this conversation can last a very long time, you know? And so thank you so much for bringing up these like very interesting ideas and threads, especially within a diasporic context as well. Like, what does memory making mean for someone in the diaspora, someone who maybe was never born or has never been to the area that it happened, but still feels the effects of the genocide? Like, so much there, so many complications. Perhaps we should move on to questions for the last 10 or so minutes. I was wondering, does anyone have any questions? You feel free to put it in the chat, and then I can ask Samantha directly.
And I'm also happy to answer questions about kind of any aspect of the work, you know, working with victims and survivors, theory, practice, my own experience in a different country. So really, I'm happy to answer anything that will be of use.
Yeah, I have the chat open, so feel free to put in questions. If not, I'm also happy. I have a few questions for Samantha as well for the last 10 minutes. That might be applicable for everybody, so I'm happy to ask that as well. Why don't I ask, and if anyone's got any questions, feel free to send either me a message or send Samantha or Aberna a message as well. So just in terms of your work, Samantha, like, how did you get involved in genocide work? And, you know, what was your experience doing interviews, going through schooling? Just like, how did you decide this is what you wanted to do and study?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody wakes up or even college says, oh, I want to, you know, go get my PhD in Holocaust and genocide history.
Yeah.
But I think for me, I was very interested in people's stories, especially where they had been maybe untold or not been able to be connected to any kind of like impact or outcome. And so after university, college, I did actually the Teach for America program for some time, and I applied for a Fulbright to work in Switzerland to look at Jewish children who were rescued during World War II, escaping the Nazi regime and smuggled to Switzerland. And what I had noticed was there was a lot of information about the routes they took specifically through France, but not what happened to them once they arrived in Switzerland. And most of those kids did survive. And so what was interesting also is that these rescued children actually didn't feel like they were really Holocaust survivors as compared to people who survived in concentration camps or hidden children. They really felt that their stories didn't matter as much. And so it was a really interesting process. I think I conducted like 60 oral history interviews in that year, and learning especially about what happens in this kind of like early refugee situation. And from there, I started at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. You know, everyone was working on modern cases, and I felt like this outlier. Oh, I had worked on the Holocaust, modern European history, where do I fit in? And that's actually when I learned about the field of transitional justice, you know, moving from atrocity crimes or genocide to peace, and had the opportunity to go work at the Kigali Genocide Memorial for a summer, and I continued there when I returned to my master's program. And I think that the most important thing to me was, you know, a lot of my classmates at the Fletcher School are doing really hard work, you know, in humanitarian settings, with very challenging issues, conflict, post-conflict, et cetera. And not everyone can stay in those positions. They're hard, they're challenging, they're stressful. And so I figured that if I could manage it, I should try. And from there, I just, you know, became really interested in the subject, especially even though it was very hard to interview people and hear their stories, I was really pleased with my ability to become embedded in Rwandan community and make friends and speak French and learn Kinyarwanda and, you know, be a part of a lot of positive life experiences after the genocide. And so that balance really helped me with the extended field work. Having friends who were artists, who were coffee producers, who were teachers, who were in tourism had nothing to do with genocide studies, friends who were survivors, who were not survivors, who were refugees, I mean, everybody. So I think that really helped me balance living and working in Rwanda. And also I really benefited from having an extended period of time in Rwanda, which I know not every student or candidate has the ability to do that. It was a huge luxury regarding funding and time and schedule. And so I found that really, really helpful in terms of being able to go be in spaces where other people maybe were not able to go, and things like that.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for all your help and this really fascinating and interesting discussion. It was so meaningful and really, really powerful, I think, for me, and I'm sure for everyone else on this call as well. I'm just going to send you a quick note so you know what I'm talking about. Thank you so much as well. I look forward to, you know, continuing the relationship between you and Pearl. And I really appreciate all your work. And thank you so much for everything that we've done. And hopefully we can continue having these conversations.